This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 974 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. The NFL Combine starts this week, so it's the perfect time to finish up this two-part series on players who produced like studs in college. Last week, if you missed it, I talked all about running backs. Today, we're on to wide receiver. It may be better to start with that episode that I did last week. So if you haven't listened to it, hit pause, go listen, then come back to this one. But the idea for today's show is simple. I'm going to be looking at successful fantasy wide receivers in the NFL. I'm then going to look at their college production profiles to see what kind of traits that they shared in college. The final step then is to layer on top this year's draft class and see if anyone in this year's class had those production traits. I'll see if anyone from this year's class produced like a stud. Now, before getting to the data, remember that the Late Round Prospect Guide is available for pre-order right now. This year's guide has even more information than ever before. You get info on everything that goes into my prospect and year two models. You get profiles for every running back and wide receiver at this year's combine. You get year two profiles for about 40 second-year running backs and wide receivers. And I've added what I'm calling categories to the model this year that help categorize players into different buckets depending on their overall scores in both the ZAP model and the year two one. I'm putting a lot of effort into this. I think you guys will enjoy it. You can pre-order it right now over on lateround.com for $14.99. On March 10th when it launches, that price is going to go up by $5. Also, even though the fantasy football season is over, it's not really over. Over on Underdog right now, you can enter drafts for the 2025 season. If you know your prospects well, if you have a good grasp on free agency, you can have an edge on your competition. If you want to check it out, draft some teams, head to underdogfantasy.com and sign up. When you do, use promo code LATEROUND to get up to $1,000 in bonus cash. That's underdogfantasy.com. So what exactly is a successful fantasy football wide receiver? I asked that same question at running back, and I ended up defining a stud running back as someone who gave fantasy managers multiple seasons of 14 or more PPR points per game since 2011. With wide receiver, we're going to up that just a bit to 15 PPR points per game. So wide receivers since 2011 who have scored 15 or more PPR points per game in multiple seasons. And to qualify for a season, that wide receiver had to have played at least 8 games. Now, a lot of those wide receivers were drafted a long time ago. Not all of them are in my prospect database. That database includes every wideout who was either drafted or at the NFL Combine since 2011. So after removing some of the older guys, I was left with 34 wide receivers, 34 stud wide receivers. Those guys range from Nico Collins to Cooper Kupp to T.Y. Hilton to Randall Cobb. It captures the best of the best over the last decade plus. The NFL Combine this year invited 49 wide receivers. It was 48, but Travis Hunter was a late add as a wide receiver. He'll be there as a corner and a wideout. Now, what I'm looking to do is compare those 49 Combine invites to our stud sample of 34 wide receivers. Which ones look like they produced like studs in college? To help me out, I'm going to only use the thing that goes into my prospect model, and that's breakout score. Now, I mentioned breakout score in last week's episode on running backs, and at wide receiver, the concept is exactly the same. And it uses the same metric, which is receiving yards per team pass attempt. That's prorated for games played, minimum 6 games played in a season to qualify. Receiving yards per team pass attempt has become a generally accepted predictive metric for wide receivers in the prospecting space. It simply takes a player's receiving yards in a given season, and it divides that number by the number of pass attempts that his team had. This allows players to work on a similar playing field from the standpoint that a pass-heavy offense isn't automatically creating the best production profiles. A player can be really good in receiving yards per team pass attempts while having lower raw production. And a player can have insane raw production, but be benefiting from a team that throws the ball a lot. Now, this is obviously not a flawless metric. No metric is. Quarterback play can influence this to some degree. Competition can influence it. But it does get signal. There is predictiveness to it, so we shouldn't ignore it. Now, receiving yards per team pass attempt, we'll look at that standalone today. That'll be one of the two metrics that we use to compare our stud sample to the NFL Combine invites. The metric that I care about more, though, is what I introduced before I started rambling, and that's breakout score. Breakout score is like an enhanced version of receiving yards per team pass attempt. It adjusts that number, that receiving yards per team pass attempt number, for two things: age and strength of opponent. If a player hits a high receiving yards per team pass attempt at a young age, that's telling us that that player is probably pretty good. And a wide receiver is going to have an easier time getting to a high receiving yards per team pass attempt rate when playing at a smaller program than, say, like Alabama or LSU. So program strength does matter. I take strength of schedule metrics from College Football Reference and I layer that on top to help create breakout score. The wide receiver ZAP model, which is my wide receiver prospect model, it really only looks at breakout score. It also looks at rushing production, but breakout score is a key piece of the model. And it's because breakout score alone gets a lot of signal. It's pretty predictive. It's not everything. I've got things like teammate score and draft capital in the model as well. But it's a really important metric. Breakout score comes in the form of a raw number, but I translate it to 0 to 100 in order to make it more consumable for you guys. So when I refer to it, I'll be referring to it on that scale. A score of 0 obviously means that the player never broke out. His receiving yards per team pass attempt number was just way too low. A score of 100 means that profile is absolutely nuts. Today, we're going to focus heavily on that metric, all while throwing in some context and seeing what these combine invites are all about. Okay, so when looking at our stud sample group, the average breakout score was 82. The average best season receiving yards per team pass attempt rate was 3.03. So in their best season, they averaged a receiving yards per team pass attempt rate of 3.03. That probably doesn't make any sense to people who aren't prospecting through data. But anything over the 3 mark is usually really good. Both of those numbers are strong. I'm sure you'd expect that because I'm not going to talk about metrics that don't matter. We would expect good fantasy wide receivers to score well in those metrics. Now let's compare that to this year's class. This year's class has an average breakout score of about 46, so well below that 82 mark from our stud sample. And remember, the stud sample had a best season receiving yards per team pass attempt average of 3.03. This class is at 2.48. Now, there were a few wide receivers from this year's class to hit on those two averages: the 82 breakout score, the 3.03 receiving yards per team pass attempt rate in their best season. But before we talk about them, let's look at some wide receivers who didn't get there, some of whom didn't even get close. Now, in our stud sample, only 3 wide receivers failed to reach a breakout score of 60. Those were Devontae Adams, Michael Thomas, and Tyreek Hill. A lot of the later round hits, like a Puka Nacua, they were even able to get to that 60 mark. In this year's class, 32 of the 49 wide receivers were below a breakout score of 60. And some of them are projected to get drafted relatively high. One of them is Matthew Golden out of Texas. According to NFLMockDraftDatabase.com, Golden's currently projected to get selected at the end of the first round. And I have plenty of concerns about his production profile. For some context, Golden's breakout score is 51.4. So he's not a 0 within that metric, but he's also basically average within it. That's because his best season in receiving yards per team pass attempt was well below 2. It's 1.82. Now, to be fair, in the model, that number gets adjusted for strength of schedule. And when it's adjusted, it looks more like 2.28 instead of 1.82. But even still, that's pretty low. It's still leading to a breakout score of only 51. Here's a list of first-round wide receivers since 2011 who had breakout scores below 60. And yes, this is an arbitrary parameter. You'll find some round 2 players with scores that low who end up hitting at a higher rate. But I still find this really interesting. Those first-round wideouts with breakout scores below 60 include Cordero Patterson, Kelvin Benjamin, Brashad Perriman, Kevin White, Josh Doxson, Zay Flowers, Xavier Legette, and Ricky Pearsall. As of right now, the only real probable long-term hit out of that group is maybe Zay Flowers. Now, hopefully we see something out of Xavier Legette, and hopefully we see something out of Ricky Pearsall. But right now, we just don't know. Overall, though, that's not a great group of wide receivers. Now, Golden's boosted a little bit by teammate scores, so his profile isn't as high risk as some of the other first rounders in the past. but I definitely think that he's got a high variance profile overall, just based on what we've seen historically. Now, another player with a sub 60 breakout score is Xavier Restrepo. Restrepo is a quintessential slot receiver. According to Pro Football Focus data, he lined up in the slot on over 90% of his collegiate routes. That ranks second in the class within that category. Now, according to NFL Mock Draft Database, he's projected to go in the top 100 right now, but his breakout score is 48.9. Now, I'm not like immensely concerned with this, especially for a slot. We'll sometimes get worse profiles out of guys who project to play solely a slot role at the next level. But for what it's worth, since 2020, we've only had a few top 100 picks with slot rates as high as Restrepo's. And 3 of the guys that got there, KJ Hamler, Trey Tucker, and Malachi Corley, they weren't hits. I think Restrepo is a better prospect than at least 2 of those 3 guys. KJ Hamler actually had okay production, but there are still some red flags there. Now, one of the things the ZAP model looks at for wide receivers is rushing production. It doesn't need like 500 career yards of rushing production, it actually caps that number in the model. But getting some rushing production can be helpful for wide receiver scores. A good example of that is with Ladd McConkey last year. Now, the reason there's some signal there is because when players are used in a lot of different ways in college, that tells us that they might be talented. And that leads me to Savion Williams. Now, look, he looks like an uber athlete. He's not like many prospects that I've seen come out. He's got a lot of size, with many places listing him at 6'5", 225 pounds. We'll see what the NFL Combine says this week. But at TCU, he would take snaps out of the Wildcat, and he'd get a lot of work on the ground. He had 51 carries for 322 yards and 6 touchdowns on the ground last year. The problem is, not only did he play at TCU for 5 years, so he's an older prospect, but he never really got it done as a receiver, analytically at least. His breakout score is 0 after a best season yards per team pass attempt rate of only 1.36. It's very, very rare for a wide receiver to hit in fantasy football with numbers that low. Like, you could point at Tyreek Hill, but he didn't have the most normal journey to the pros, and he's an absolute outlier. Now, Williams is not toast in the ZAP model because of that rushing production, but he's probably the highest variance wide receiver in this year's draft class. Now, there are 3 more wide receivers I really want to get to real quick who have red flags. One is Jalen Royals. He started playing college ball at Georgia Military College before transferring to Utah State. He had a good junior and senior season there, including a senior year with a prorated receiving yards per team pass attempt mark of 3.12. That's above our NFL stud sample. Unfortunately, Utah State doesn't get that much love in the strength of schedule department. So he got dinged for that. His breakout score fell below 50 as a result. I don't totally mind Royals, though. One of his analytical comps ended up being Rashee Rice, which I found really interesting. I think Rice has a little bit more yak ability, but Royals does have some of that. It's not a bad comp to have. Next is Tez Johnson. I've had multiple people in my mentions and in my email about Tez Johnson over the last month or so. And I gotta say, I kind of see it, but I don't totally see it. For one, he's definitely undersized. Now, we've seen smaller wide receiver success in recent memory, but he's been listed at sub 170 pounds, which is not ideal. More importantly, the smaller wide receivers who have succeeded historically have come with good breakout scores. Johnson's is 48.9. He's one of those cases where his yards per route run rate is better than his receiving yards per team pass attempt one. Usually those two things correlate, but sometimes they are a little bit different. And we saw hits out of profiles like that over the last couple of years with Ladd McConkey and Puka Nacua. But for what it's worth, the model liked Nacua and McConkey a lot more than Tez Johnson. So I have my concerns. And then finally, there's Nick Nash. He played at San Jose State for 6 seasons. He started off as a quarterback. Now, most know Nash because he won the wide receiver triple crown last year. He led the nation in catches, yards, and touchdowns. And as a result, he was a Bolitnikov finalist, but he lost to Travis Hunter. With Nick Nash, this is a classic case that I was talking about earlier, where a player has crazy raw statistics. Everyone thinks that his production profile must look amazing. But context makes it a lot less appealing. Nash had these monster numbers, but even his unadjusted receiving yards per team pass attempt mark was 2.71 last year. That's good, but it wasn't even as high as our stud sample average. And that was at San Jose State. Now, we should be a little bit lenient here with Nash because he wasn't playing wide receiver at a high level for a super long time. But I've seen a lot of people be really high on Nash as like this year's day 3 sleeper. And look, if he finds a spot with a great coaching staff like the Rams, I'll probably be in. But he's going to be a 25-year-old rookie with production marks that aren't nearly as good as people think. There's a chance that this could go south. So those are the bigger call-outs to make for guys who failed to reach a breakout score of 60. There are tons of players who didn't get to 80. Travis Hunter's breakout score was 66.9. Now, overall, analytically, he's not terrible by any means, but I don't see generational wide receiver with his numbers. But obviously, those numbers need a little bit of context. I feel like I could go on and on with Travis Hunter. So if anyone has a mailbag question, wants to throw that my way about Hunter, feel free. And then some other wide receivers who are below that 80 mark, but above the 60 mark. You got Isaiah Bond, who was barely below that 80 number. Alec Iamaner, he didn't get there. Jaden Higgins was at 74.7. The vast majority of wide receivers in this class, for what it's worth, did not get to a breakout score of 80. There were 4 guys who did, though. Luther Burden, Tedaroa McMillan, Emeka Egbuka, and Trey Harris. Those are the 4 wide receivers who all got there. Now, technically, Egbuka didn't get to a receiving yards per team pass attempt of 3.0. But we'll just consider these 4 players the analytical studs of this class. 3 of them, I think, are really good. Now, I sent kind of a controversial engagement baity tweet last week saying that Luther Burden was wide receiver 1. I don't usually send tweets like that. I kind of regretted it immediately. It was mostly to get the conversation going, but it's so early in the process, I'm still learning about these players. But make no mistake, right now, today, I do have Luther Burden as my wide receiver 1. His sophomore season at Missouri was probably the best individual season in this year's draft class. And as a result of that, he has the highest breakout score in this class at 96.3. Now, there are some troubling signs to his profile that the model's just not picking up on. He had a lot of manufactured touches, a lot of behind the line of scrimmage looks, and he really only had that one great season. So while the model is going to be incredibly high on him, I think it's okay to approach him with some doubt. But I do think the upside is crazy. He fits that DJ Moore kind of Malik Neighbors archetype that we've seen be successful in this era of NFL. I've got a lot more about Burden in the prospect guide. Next is Tet McMillan. I think he's probably a little bit safer of a bet because we've seen multiple seasons of high production from him. Some have comped him to Drake London, but I will say London had an elite breakout score in the ZAP model. McMillan's breakout score is solid, but it's 83. It's not quite Drake London-esque. And that's why McMillan's top analytical comps, are T. Higgins and Cortland Sutton. I think he can make that kind of impact as the top size guy in this class. Now, Emeka Egbuka, he's next. I think he's just a really solid prospect all around. You're looking at an 89 breakout score, but his best season in receiving yards per team pass attempt, like I said earlier, didn't quite get to that 3.0 mark. But his comps in the model include Robert Woods and Chris Godwin. I'm envisioning him primarily as a slot guy who can play on the perimeter, but be mostly a high-end reliable slot player at the next level. Like I said, I think there's 3 wide receivers in this class who are really, really good, will probably be in the same tier for me post-draft, but we'll see. A lot can change. And I'm going to push Travis Hunter aside for now for obvious reasons. We don't even know how much wide receiver he's actually going to play. The final player, though, to get these stud wide receiver marks is Trey Harris. I said earlier that Luther Burden's sophomore season is the best season in this year's draft class, but Trey Harris's final year at Mississippi, that's up there too. His 2024 campaign. Last year, he had a yards per route run rate over 5 yards. That is unheard of, especially at a bigger program. We're not talking like some random small school. His receiving yards per team pass attempt, which is prorated for the record, was 3.86. The problem analytically for Harris is that he's not going to get the draft capital more than likely that the other 3 wide receivers that I just talked about will. But he's also an older prospect. He was in college for 5 years. He's about to turn 23 years old. So the model doesn't like him nearly as much as the other players that I'm talking about. I think he is a very high variance wide receiver, but there's still a lot to like. Now, I know that was a whirlwind. I have so many more takes on players in this class and so many more in-depth takes that you can find in the prospect guide. This is more of a primer than anything else. But hopefully you feel more prepared to sit back and watch the NFL Combine this weekend and really enjoy it. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. It's a mailbag week. I'll have one for you on Friday. Make sure you get those questions in. Otherwise, enjoy your week. I'll talk to you then.